Hello and welcome to the Hot Seat. I'm here with Maja Rasmussen to discuss the upcoming European elections. Maja, welcome.
Thank you.
First of all, will these European elections be different? And if they are, why?
Well, the European Parliament is running the campaign under the banner that this time is different. And it's claiming that this time is different because the European Parliament can indirectly choose the Commission President. So in the Lisbon Treaty, which came into force in December 2009, it was stated that the European Council, where you have the European heads of states, had to take into account the outcome of the European Parliament election when they appoint the head of the European Commission, which is currently Barroso. And the head of the European Commission then had to be approved by the European Parliament. Now, interestingly, the European Parliament has interpreted this as their right to choose who becomes the new Commission of, who becomes the President of the European Commission. So each of the big political groups have put forward candidates which they would like to become the new President of the European Commission if they get to be the biggest group in the European Parliament. So currently from the three biggest groups, you have three candidates. From the EPP, you got the Belgian Jean-Claude Juncker, who is a former Prime Minister of Belgium and who for a long time, until the end of 2013, served as the President of the Eurogroup. Then from the SD, you got the German Social Democrat Martin Schulz, who is currently the President in the European Parliament. And then lastly, from the ALDE group, you got a guy from Belgium called Guy Verhofstadt, who also has a past as a Prime Minister in Belgium. So they're hoping, if the EPP becomes the biggest groups, they're hoping that their nominated person for the Commission President will become the actual Commission President. But you could also say that this time is different if you look through another pair of lenses. So you could look at the fact that we have gone through a hard economic and financial crisis. You can see in opinion polls, if you look at Eurobarometer, that there is a really low trust in the EU. So 60% of the last respondents who were asked about the trust in the EU institutions in the Eurobarometer surveys said that they had really low trust. So in a way, you could see the European Parliament elections as somehow as taking the temperature of the public confidence in the EU institutions. So that would be another way to answer your question why this time is different.
So what impact does the European Parliament have in the appointment of the Commission?
Well, you could talk about kind of two stages of having an impact. So first of all, they need to approve of the European Council's nominee for the President of the European Commission. And as I talked about before, the nominated person for the President of the European Commission is likely to be influenced by the European Parliament elections in terms of that he or she would come from a group that is also going to be the biggest groups in the European Parliament. So it will be of the same ideological colour, most likely. It's not entirely sure. Because it is a whole puzzle in the sense that there are several posts where the EU institutions need to find a person for. So you got the President of the European Commission, you got the Higher Representatives of Foreign and Security Affairs, where you currently have Lady Ashton in the seat, and you got to find a new President of the European Council, where you have Van Rompuy at the moment. So in a way, it's a little bit of a puzzle because you have to get to agreement between these three seats, and they will most likely be negotiated at the same time. So lots of things are at play when you have to decide who's taking up these three different seats. But once the Commission President is settled and has been approved by the European Parliament by a simple majority, the European Commission President would then come up with a suggestion for who should be the commissioner of each of the different policy areas. And this would be based on the nominees that have been put forward by national governments. And in the treaty, it's stated that the entire Commission has to be approved by the European Parliament. So in the treaty, it's not stated that the Parliament can kind of sack nominees for individual commissioners. But in reality, what has happened is that Parliament quite often likes to interpret its power as being more than what is stated in the treaty. So they have since 1994 instituted these hearings in each of the committees where they invite the Commission designate for a particular policy area to come and before the European Parliament and be part of a hearing. So it's almost a little bit of an audition. And following these hearings, the Conference of Committee Chairs will send a letter to the Commission President where they would comment on the abilities of this Commission designate in the particular policy area. They will talk about the personal qualifications and the ability to talk before the European Parliament. They might even comment on whether or not they like the person, if they think the person is humorous or not. And then the Commission President decides on the basis of that whether he wants to keep all of the Commissioner designates. It has happened in the past, in 2009, that the Commission President at the time, Barroso, decided to remove one of his candidates, a Bulgarian Commissioner designate, because he was not approved informally by the European Parliament. So even though on paper they don't have influence to sack individual nominees, in reality, they can put pressure on the Commission President to remove and replace one Commission designate.
What are the polls showing in terms of a likely outcome of the elections?
So you got Poll Watch, which is run by Simon Hicks here at the LSE, together with some people in Brussels, looking at the polls in all 28 member states and aggregating it and looking at, well, what political groups are likely to get most seats and how many seats are they likely to get inside the European Parliament. And you can see two trends. So first of all, you can see that the big political groups, the Socialist group, the S&D, the EPP, the centre-right, and the Liberal group, ALDE, is going to go back in terms of the number of seats they have at the moment. So for instance, the EPP, according to the polls at the moment, are going to lose 59 seats inside the European Parliament. The Socialist groups are going to lose 9 seats, and the Liberal groups are going to lose 22 seats. Another trend we can see is that the fringe groups are going to do really well if we trust the opinion polls, and that we're going to have a lot of non-attached members inside the European Parliament. So in a sense, the European Parliament is becoming much more fragmented if we look at the diversity of political parties you're going to have inside the Parliament.
So what will all of this mean for the actual workings of the European Parliament?
Well, it will paradoxically mean that the Parliament is going to be more fragmented in terms of the diversity in political parties they have, but the day-to-day politics is going to be more centrist. And that can sound a little bit as a paradox, because why, if you have a strengthening of the extreme right and the extreme left, why are you going to see a much more centred Parliament? But the reason is to be found in the voting rules inside the European Parliament. So in the second reading, you need to have a qualified majority to get things through at the plenary. And there you already have what is called an absolute, there you already have a grand coalition, because you have an absolute majority, whereby the big groups, the ALDE, the Socialist and the EPP, they vote together. But because the ALDE group in the middle has until now had the role as a little bit of a kingmaker, you had seen situation in certain policy areas where the winning coalition will be made up of the EPP and ALDE group. You have seen that especially on economic and internal market matters, whereas in other policy areas such as the environment and civil rights, you have seen a winning coalition consisting of the ALDE group and the S&D and a few of the fringes groups on the centre-left. But because the ALDE group is going to suffer so significantly if the opinion polls are correct, they would no longer be able to be the kingmaker inside the European Parliament. And that means, in order to get legislation passed, that the S&D, the centre-left group, and the EPP, the centre-right groups, will have to vote together in most of the votes in order to carry things through the European Parliament. So, for instance, you could look at some very important votes that we're going to have in the new Parliament, which is the trade agreement between the EU and the US, which has not been finalized yet, and the new Parliament, starting in September, will have to vote upon this. And there you could imagine that the agreement would look slightly different, because there were lots of concerns that the Socialists and the Greens did not get into the agreement, such as concerns about labour rights, employee rights and employment concerns. And given that the S&D and EPP will have to vote together, you could imagine that some of these concerns will have to be addressed. Similarly, you could also imagine on the annual budgets that could be more difficult to pass, because that's usually an area where the Socialist and the centre-right, the EPP, are often at loggerheads with one another. So there you could imagine that negotiations would take a lot longer to go through the Parliament, and things will become somehow less efficient, because compromises between the left and the right will have to be found.
So what sort of role have the Eurosceptic right parties to play in the Parliament when it gets down to it doing its day-to-day work?
Well, generally you can see that they don't have a lot of influence over the voting outcomes in the European Parliament, because many of them, they refuse to participate in the legislative works of the European Parliament. They don't put forward amendments. They are very reactionary, so they quite often vote no at the plenary sessions, or they completely stay away. So that's kind of the commonality between these extreme right-wing MEPs. But generally you could talk about kind of free roles among right-wing MEPs. And this is based on a study by Nathalie Brack from Brussels, who finds that MEPs on the extreme right can either be seen as kind of absentees, public speakers, or pragmatists. So the absentees is the typical MEP, such as Nick Griffin or Marine Le Pen, who would hardly spend any time in the European Parliament. They're hardly ever present. They only come to the plenary once in a while because they want to avoid having sanctions for not being there. And they spent most of the time at the national level rallying and campaigning against the EU. So they are very present at the national level and in the national media, but not in the European Parliament. Then you have a politician such as Nigel Farage, as we have talked about earlier, who is seen as a public speaker. So again, he doesn't really participate in much of the legislative work. He doesn't get rapporteurships. He doesn't really write amendments. He hardly participates in the vote in the plenary. And when he participates, he usually votes no as a reaction against the EU system. But he's very active. So he holds lots of speeches. He would write lots of questions to the European Commission. And the Commission has to respond to these questions. So in that sense, he's being very active inside the European Parliament by holding speeches both in the European Parliament and also nationally. And he has a lot of presence, or these types of MEPs have a lot of presence in the national media. And then lastly, you got the kind of pragmatic MEP, where you could talk about the British Conservatives, you could talk about the Danish People's Party, who know that their views and in some areas are not kind of part of the mainstream views. They're very EU critical towards certain aspects, but they also want to try to get influence where they can. So they do acknowledge that they don't get a lot of rapporteurships and they don't have a lot of influence, but they nevertheless try to kind of participate in the work of the European Parliament by writing amendments, by voting, and by being very active. So if we look at the first two types, the absent right-wing MEP and the public speaker, you could say that although they don't have a lot of tangible influence in the European Parliament, they are able to set the discourse nationally. And in that way, they might be able to undermine the legitimacy of the EU by constantly criticizing the EU and getting a lot of airtime in the national media. So they are able to kind of frame the debate nationally. And you see that with the theme of, or the fear of welfare tourism, that that is a fear and a theme that takes up a lot of time in the national media, not only in the UK, but also in Denmark, the Netherlands and Germany. And it is a fear that has been brought forward particularly by right-wing populist parties, and then also taken up by mainstream parties because they have not been able to avoid it. So nationally they can really influence the discourse and the narrative of the EU, and then in that sense indirectly stall the integration process in the long run.
All right, thank you very much, Maja. You're off the hot seat.
Thank you.